Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
Hi, welcome to another edition of Poetry Today. I know you're expecting to see Jennifer Dotson. I'm Ron Levitsky. I'm subbing for her. Jennifer's not well today, and we wish her a speedy recovery. We have a wonderful guest, and we didn't want to wait to bring her before you. We know how much you love poetry, and we have a wonderful poet. In fact, in a world of distinguished poets that Jennifer has on, this is a really exceptional lady. I'd like to welcome Olivia Maciel Edelman. Olivia, welcome, and we're just delighted to have you today.
I'm delighted to be here with you. It's a pleasure and really an honor to be here working with you with such a wonderful team in Highland Park.
Well, yes, and that Highland Park. And we have before us like a smorgasbord of books of poetry that you've written over the past 20 years. And we have the most recent one, East on Central, which a lot of people I know recognize in Highland Park. Many people probably have contributed to this, and Olivia's poetry is in this book. There's another publication that's from Swan Isle Press, which is also published in Highland Park. So as much as Olivia knows about Highland Park, we want to make sure that people recognize that Olivia is a poet well beyond our borders. For example, she won first prize for poetry in Spanish by Northeastern Illinois University in 1914. She's won the Poets House Award, New York City, in 1996, for one of the 3 best books of poetry in the United States. And she won the Jose Marti Award for essay writing in homage to Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz by the University of Houston and the Consular Body of Houston. That's just a few of her awards, her honors, and again, at least a half a dozen books dealing with poetry in Spanish, often translated into English. So, since you seem to have spoken Spanish as your first language, let's talk a little bit about your background, if we may. So I take it you weren't born in the United States?
No, I wasn't. I was born in Mexico City. I came to the United States, initially came to Boston. And my husband was had graduated at the time from college there. And then subsequently we made the move to the Midwest. I came to Chicago years ago, and I've always loved the Midwest.
Really? I
loved the prairie, the barns, and was greatly inspired by, the likes of Hemingway and Carl Sandburg and his poetry. And so for me, Chicago is a very dear city. What would we do without Lake Michigan?
In the winter we'd like to do without, but certainly you're right about the lake. It's lovely. So you came over to the United States about when, in terms of your age? Were you a teenager or a young woman?
I was a little older than teenager, but perhaps around my teenage years. And I came to the United States around the time when the Red Sox, this is my recollection, as I mentioned, I came to Boston, so the Red Sox at the time were in vogue, and Louis Tiant was really batting great for the team. And so then, at around that time, a year or two after, I came to Chicago.
Oh, okay, and I would think that coming or having experienced 2 cultures,
yes,
can be maybe challenging, confusing, but also an advantage for a person, especially a writer. How do you feel about being a person in a sense of 2 cultures?
Yes, I have to mention that being from Mexico City, which is a city with many, many, many cultures, not just indigenous people, but with a very complex kind of history in terms of multi-layers of meaning and texture. The Spaniards coming in the 1500s and having the colonial period going into the Baroque period and the colonial period and moving on to the age of Romanticism and then moving on to contemporary times. There's always this multi-layering of complexity that was going on around me. And so growing up in Mexico City, I was growing up in an area called Colonia Roma, and I was being exposed to all kinds of languages, not just the language of indigenous people who would move from the countryside into Mexico City, but also to the people of to the languages of immigrants who had come into Mexico City during World War II. Mexico accepted as refugees many people from Spain, also from Europe. I grew up actually hearing quite a bit of Ladino language, which is the language that some of the Jewish immigrants who had come from Turkey were speaking in the area where I grew up around Mexico City.
It's interesting.
I would listen to Yiddish. Yiddish was a language that was spoken around me in the area where I grew up in Mexico City. My parents, in my own background, had Portuguese and Italian and Mexican background. Portuguese going back to the 1500s with a Sephardi type of link and connection. And so this multi-layering was really complementary in my new environment in the United States and Chicago. I felt very much at home, hearing languages here in Chicago from many areas, Polish, Greek, so on and so forth.
Let's take that and then let's bring it over to your writing. Now, I noticed that you're an academic. You're currently teaching at North Central College.
Correct.
Yes. And you teach Spanish or Latin American?
Yes, I teach Spanish and Latin American culture, and I have taught these courses both to undergraduate students and to graduate students. I've taught at the University of Chicago, at Northwestern University, University of Illinois at Chicago. So I have quite a bit of experience with students of all kinds in the city.
That's wonderful. Let's then move this rich cultural matrix that you have, and tell us about when you began writing poetry and what kind of compelled you to write poetry.
Well, I began to write as a little girl. I did not necessarily begin writing poetry right away. What I began doing when I was a little girl is that I was very interested in words that I didn't know the meaning of. So I began keeping a dictionary, shall we say. And so I would write words that I didn't understand the meaning of, and then I would try to find the meaning of those words. And but writing in a more dedicated way, in a more formal way, where I wanted to delve into, what is the meaning of really, what does the metaphor mean, or what does synecdoche mean, or the different types of versification that we have in the language, in Spanish. Romance. What is a romance, which is an octosyllabic type of verse? All this came to me a little later when I began to formally undertake, my studies, my doctoral studies, my master's degree studies, and I was greatly inspired by by poets like Garcia Lorca, for example.
And he was a Spanish poet. I think he died during the Spanish Civil War. Is that right?
Yes, Federico Garcia Lorca was a poet who is grouped with other poets, poets called of a generation of 27. And I actually wrote a poem dedicated to him, to his memory.
Which we're going to take a look at shortly.
Yes, so I was inspired by, the poetry of other poets, not just the Spanish poets like Cernuda, or Octavio Paz, a Mexican poet, or Javier Villaurrutia, but really I began reading other poets as well. Paul Celan, for example, or Akhmatova. I began reading all kinds
Russian,
of poets.
right? Anna Akhmatova. Oh, wow. Yeah, so you're talking about someone who experienced the World War I, World War II, her fortune was taken away, her husband died, very sad, but a very courageous woman.
Very courageous woman, and so my writing in a more dedicated sort of way to the craft of poetry was influenced also by having met Denise Levertov. I remember coming to Boston and having met Denise Levertov and hearing about certain groups of poets here in the United States and the beat poets, right? Then we can begin talking about
Ginsberg.
Yes.
Okay, that may be another show. Why don't we pause for a moment? And since you mentioned Lorca, why don't you read your first poem that you plan to read? And you asked me to read it in English. I'm not going to do it justice, but I'll give it a shot. And then maybe you could talk about what in the poem is reminiscent of Lorca and how he influenced you.
Okay, very good. We'll do that. So I will read the poem.
Okay. And in English, it's called Vernal Equinox 2, to the memory of Federico Garcia Lorca.
Equinoccio vernal, a la memoria de Federico García Lorca. Ay, qué ausencia, Narciso, la de tus caricias redonditas sobre mi frente, redonditas, y las palmas de tus manos, dos flores de cempasúchil estallando pétalos mis besos, y el leve toque amarillo cuneiforme de tu meñique sobre el óvulo de mi oreja, y tu pelo suave escapándoseme hasta de la ausencia, quizá para siempre, como agua entre los dedos, y la ausencia de tu lengua juguetona sobre la comisura de mis labios, como aire.
Everything sounds better in Spanish.
Well,
all right, I'll try this. Ah, Narcissus, what an absence. Your index finger tracing little circles over my forehead, circles. And the palms of your hands, two cempasúchils, bursting with petals, my kisses, the soft, yellow, cuneiform touch of your little fingertip on my earlobe, and your soft hair escaping me, escaping absence itself, perhaps forever, like water between my fingers, and the absence of your playful tongue in the corners of my mouth, like air. Before the show started, you were explaining to me the word I've had difficult time pronouncing, cempasúchils.
Yes, cempasúchil is a yellow flower. It looks a little bit like a small dahlia or a small chrysanthemum, but it is different. Maybe also like a carnation, but it's yellow, bright yellow. And in Mexico, in many indigenous communities, I'm sure you might have heard of the Day of the Dead celebration, where people honor their dear ones who have passed away. And there is a tradition of making these paths and adorning them with these cempasúchil flowers, because there is the belief that these paths of yellow flowers may lead to heaven spiritually, certainly, and that the dear ones come back on those days to dwell in the abodes of their dear ones. And so that's where the word cempasúchil comes from. I would see those flowers when I was growing up in Mexico City in the markets, and markets are full of color and vibrancy. So that's where that came from.
The poem, and I only was just introduced to it, but it strikes me as being very sensual. Mm-hmm. And I think of the Song of Solomon, for example. It's very, very vivid and it's very tactile. Mm-hmm. You kind of follow the finger, yes, tracing, and the palms of the hands. So everything is very touching, feeling, soft hair. Is that how Lorca influenced you? That it's just so tactile, so sensual?
Well, I think that Lorca. What attracted me about Lorca was his ability to synthesize these images of apparently or seemingly disparate realms of meaning. And so bringing these disparate images in his poetry, syntactically speaking, was very captivating. And I wanted to read him a little more and understand that. Later on, I did read poetry when I was a little girl. I remember reading Octavio Paz when I was around 12 years old. But the poets of Generación del 27 were greatly influenced by Surrealism. And Surrealism is not just a philosophy, but it's an aesthetic. And what André Breton would say, who was like this black sun amongst his group of poets, and he would pass judgment on whether a poem was surrealist or not, or whether even a person should be deemed surrealist or not. And what Breton says is that if you bring two conceptual images together that may seem very discordant to each other, but when you bring them together, they sometimes, and most oftentimes, cause some kind of spark, like that. They cause a spark, and so something happens. Mm-hmm. Now, I am not a good person to analyze my lines or my poetry because I don't believe that I write with a certain kind of intent when I'm writing a poem. But certainly I was captivated by the talent and the ability of Federico Garcia Lorca to conjure up these sparks. And he's not necessarily the kind of poet that causes a shock or a shudder on the reader, but for example, Breton does, and Paul Eluard does, and some of his poetry. And Lorca is much more subtle. And there is a wonderful poem by him, A la Memoria de Ignacio Sánchez Mejías, which is a great poem on the passing of a bullfighter friend of his. And I recommend that poem to see what I'm talking about and to read what I'm talking about. I think I'm trying to honor him in this poem.
Okay. Why don't we go to the next poem from...
Sombra en Plata?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is called Laurel Leaf.
Laurel Leaf, yes. Hoja de laurel. Escaramuzas, arena a través del cristal, un ovillo, carencia, caricia, pétalo albo, las partes ensimismadas sobre sí, sazonándose en ese algo enhuí amarillento. El oído se abre, una palabra se aproxima, la llaman signo, símbolo, significado, y es silencio, sí dice algo. Dice como el dado del azar levemente aperlado entre el paréntesis futurista y el nuevo canto, agonía. Resbaladizo el camino, someras las asunciones. De mañana era el esguince izquierdo, el nada sustancial de las pausas, el hundido profundo en las aguas, nueva manera de hilvanar el pensamiento, de arreglar el cartón o desarreglarlo, la mirada anegada en un color ceniciento, el paladar en rábano quemado.
Skirmishes, sand, through the window a ball of yarn, lack, caress, white petal. Parts wrapped up in themselves, seasoning in that something, yellowish ennui. The ear opens, a word comes closer. They call it sign, symbol, signified, and is it silence if it says something? It says like a rolling die lightly pearlized, between the futurist parenthesis and the new song, agony. Delicate journey, shallow assumptions. In the morning was the left strain, the substantive nothingness of the breaks, the water's sunken depth. A new way to piece together thought, to fix cardboard or mess it up. The look flooded in ashen color, the palette in burnt radish.
Engrapada la imaginación a un ser que era evanescente elevación, intento de desprender. La sábana blanca era una gran extensión, un país desierto, la fotografía en blanco y negro, solo un souvenir de aquel momento. El rebozo enrollado, dos adolescentes en sus vestidos floreados. Lacio pelo negro asegurado con clips metálicos, filigrana de encaje blanco sobre el pecho. Los rasguños de la mesa hacen guiños, llaman hacia su lisa superficie. Ah, limpieza purísima de un mosaico blanco, brillantez de un destello metálico, diligencia y devoción del escarabajo, resplandor cristalino del envase, custodia de la hoja de laurel.
Imagination stapled to a being that was evanescent elevation, an attempt to unfasten. The white sheet was a great expanse, a deserted country. The black and white photograph, just a souvenir of that moment. The wrap rolled. Two adolescents in their flowered dresses, straight black hair tied with metal clips, white lace filigree on their chests. The scratches on the table wink, call on its smooth surface. Ah, the clean purity of a white mosaic, the brilliance of a metallic flash, the diligence and devotion of the beetle, the radiance of the glass container that guards the laurel leaf. Lovely. So, in just kind of reading through it, it seemed to be a series of images, almost like photographs in an album of, look at this image, look at this image. What were you trying to get at in this poem?
The thing is about writing poems, they come and they happen, and many times, of course, I understand them, but they call to me with their hermetism, because sometimes they continue to be mysterious even to me as a writer. So this is one of those poems. I can say that the laurel leaf, we use the laurel leaf not just as a reminder of a crown of laurels, but also the laurel leaf that we use for cooking in our own kitchens. And this is one of those enigmatic poems to me that mentions the futurist parenthesis, but it's for me to ask the reader, what does it evoke in you? And for me, I could not necessarily be the best person to explain a poem or to interpret it, But the scratches on the table wink, and as I was reading the poem, I noticed the scratches on this table. And it came to my mind as I was reading the poem, is it that this poem has a connection to this particular table? Because I do see the scratches on this particular table right now. And it could be. I think that, all objects, certainly there are the energies, and writing, just like, writing poetry or writing literature, just as philosophy are paths into knowing and into knowledge, and we do see the interconnections between that which is intangible and that which is tangible.
There's something very dreamlike about this. I was thinking it reminds me a little bit of the song by the group Heart, These Dreams, where she talks about going through walls, walking through walls, and white linen, and it seemed very lovely. It seemed very dreamlike to me.
Mm-hmm.
We have just a few minutes. I wanted you to comment on your view about translation. You write it in Spanish, and either you or someone else translates it. Can it ever be the same in a different language?
Can it be the same? You mean like
have the same effect?
The same effect as in the original language. You know that there is the saying that the word translation comes from traducir, tradutore, which comes from the Latin, which means to betray. And so tradutore, traditore, to betray something. So it's not exactly the same. But I think that there are wonderful translators, and I'm very grateful to my translators. Kelly Austin was the translator for Sombra en Plata, and
does she do a translation and give it to you and you comment on it, or do you collaborate throughout as the poem is worked on?
She had some questions for me. She worked on the manuscript, and occasionally she would say, well, what did you mean? What are you trying to say with this line? And so occasionally we did have some conversations. And so, sometimes you as the author are trying to defer to the translator in the sense that the translator may have an ear, more of an idiomatic sense for the word. But sometimes it's the other way around. It's a mysterious process. And I think that there are very good translations. And I think translation can be a very creative process as well. I have translated, my first book I translated. I did have some former colleague of mine who took a look at the translations. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You are. Well, I've always thought about it being very interesting. I read once, and I don't know French, but I heard someone said that Mallarmé translated Poe even better, that it was better in French than in English. But
yes.
I don't know. To be a translator, it takes so much skill and knowledge. David Alter, the Hebrew scholar, just translated the Old Testament into English.
Yes.
And his translation, in some ways, departs greatly from previous ones, like the King James Version.
Yes.
And he, in his new book, he explains why he chooses certain words. And,
yes.
And it's fascinating. But again, that's another show.
Well, yes, and maybe you would like to share some of your writing with us sometime. It's really a pleasure to.
We want to thank Olivia, Maciel, Edelman for being with us today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And you could find her books, I'm sure, on Amazon. Don't forget East on Central, the new one. Her poetry is featured in that as well. So, Olivia, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. Thank you for your interest in my work.
Of course. Well, this is Ronald.